bought the house back in 1989, the previous owner said to me, he said, "Oh, you'll like this with what you write." I was writing my supernatural thrillers at the time. He said, "We've got 3 ghosts." I thought he was joking, but actually it turned out he was lying. They didn't have 3 ghosts here. Actually, there were 4. And I wonder if they're still here. The day we were moving in, my mother-in-law was standing just outside the front door. And just as there is here in this book, there's the porch and there's a long hallway which leads into this anteroom, we called it the atrium, which you have to go through to get into the kitchen or left into the dining room. And my mother-in-law and I were standing outside the porch, guiding the removals men who were carrying stuff in. And suddenly behind me at the end of the hallway, I just noticed there's a shadow. Nothing more than like a starling crossing a fanlight. And my mother-in-law was an interesting character. She was a very down-to-earth lady. She was the chief magistrate at the time of Hove. But she also had a phase side to her in that she used to have a certain dream if somebody she knew was going to die. And this shadow flitted like this, and she said, "Did you see that?" And I knew at that moment she'd seen something. And my then wife, Georgina, and I were both townies. We'd never lived in the countryside. We'd both been born in Brighton, and I lived in London, in Toronto, New York. And this was our dream. The house was quite a wreck when we bought it, very much like the house in the story. And then the couple moved here from Brighton. And I didn't want Georgina to be freaked out day one. So I just said to my mother-in-law, "No, I didn't see anything." Anyhow, the next day, Georgina went off to work. She was a solicitor working in Brighton, again like Caro in the book. And I was in the upstairs room on the right-hand side, which was my office. And I went down about 10:30 to make a cup of coffee. And as I entered this atrium, this anteroom, I saw these tiny pinpricks of light floating in the air. Just like little, some of them were no bigger than the size of a pinhead. Some about, the biggest one about a sort of small fingernail. And I thought it was my glasses catching the light, so I took them off, put them back on again, and the lights had vanished. And then at lunchtime I went down to make a sandwich, and I saw these lights again. And then I saw them again in the afternoon when I went down for a cup of tea. And each time I thought it was my glasses catching the sunlight through the back door which went out into the garden. And my wife came home, and I thought, well, I'm not going to tell her. Maybe I'm just imagining it and a bit spooked out by my mother-in-law from yesterday, so I said nothing. And the next day, same thing happened again. I went down for a cup of coffee. At lunchtime, I took our dog out for a walk down this lane, right down here. And we literally passed up those houses that you can see there. And this old man came up to me and said, "Are you Mr. James?" I said, "Yes." He said, "You've just bought the manor?" I said, "Yes." He said, "How are you getting on with your grey lady?" And I said, "What grey lady?" And he told me he used to house sit for the previous owners. They were away a lot. They actually had a second home in Ibiza. And he said, I was sitting in that atrium. We made it into a snug in winter because it was next to the kitchen. It had a heat from the Argo, and I had an armchair there, and I had the telly. I was sitting there one evening watching telly, and this woman in grey silk crinoline with a really angry face just came out of the oak panelling, walked towards me, and she actually flicked my face with the side of her silk dress, stung me, and she vanished into the wall behind me. He said, I was out of there 8 minutes later. He said, wild horses would not get me in that house again. And that was the starting point. And I still said nothing to my wife. And my parents-in-law came to lunch the following Sunday, and I took my mother-in-law aside, and I said, what was it you saw that morning we were moving in? And she described this woman exactly as this guy had. And then I decided to tell my wife, and she said, well, actually, I've seen her several times, didn't want to tell you and freak you out. In fact, that very first weekend, it was before my mother-in-law had come to Sunday lunch. There's a house immediately next door, the nearest neighbour, was the old stables, converted into a very nice dwelling. I was out in the garden it was a Sunday morning, and this cheerful chap popped his head over the wall and said, "Oh, how do you do? Nice to meet you. Our new neighbours." He said, "I just want to ask, did you have some friends with the baby staying last night?" And I said, "No." He said, "Oh, it must be your ghost again." And I said, "What ghost?" He said, "Oh, 1920, the drawing room had dry rot, and they dug up the floor and they found the skeleton of a small baby, and they think it was probably a servant girl back in the last century, and either she'd had this baby stillborn or perhaps had murdered it because she's illegitimate and was full of shame. And quite often people hear it crying in the night. And over the years we had a number of people staying with us who used to say they'd heard this noise. And you can very easily confuse the sound of a vixen crying at night for a baby, but this is definitely a baby. And the third ghost that we had here was kind of interesting. This house used to own all the land. You can see further on that house there, all the way around. Once upon a time it owned, I think, a couple of 100 acres around here. And it's all been built on. There's been quite a number of houses built in the 30s, 50s, 60s. And one of the houses around the corner, owned by a very down-to-earth couple. He was at the time the general manager of the company that made Filofax in Burgess Hill. And I was walking the dog past his house one day, and he came out and he said, "I wish you'd keep your bloody monk under control." I said, "Pardon?" He said, because this house used to be a monastery years back in the Middle Ages. There was a Roman villa here, then a monastery, and then there was a church house, and then it became a manor house. And he said, "I wish you keep your bloody monk under control." And I said, "Sorry, what monk?" And he said, "We just had a family christening last Sunday." He said, "Everyone gone, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, sat down with the newspaper, Sunday Express, started reading it. And suddenly the room just went stone cold, and I looked up and there was a monk in a cowled hood just staring down, looking at me. I thought it was one of my relatives playing a joke, and it turned and just went towards the kitchen, so I jumped up and hurried after it. I went in the kitchen, and there was just my wife in there washing up, and there's no door out of the kitchen anywhere. That actually behind me, above the white gates, that window there was my office window, went through both sides. And the fourth ghost was, we've got around the back, there's a long, narrow lake. It's about a quarter of a mile long. And we had one of these sort of rangers came along. We were discussing clearing some of the weeds, and then one night he told me he'd actually been chased by a Roman centurion along the footpath. And this wasn't the guy prone to particular flights of fantasy.